Okay, good. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Roll call, please.
Member Carey,
Here.
Vice Chair Marsh,
Here.
Chairman Garay,
Here.
Member Hutchins,
Here.
and alternate member Hennigan.
Here.
Let's stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag First order of business is the approval of our February 14th meeting minutes. Anybody have any comments regarding the minutes? Corrections?
I'll move approval.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.
Jerry, before you go on, I just want to mention that these set of minutes were the first set of minutes that our Assistant Town Clerk, Kathy Gatewood, had prepared, and she did a great job. I just
Oh,
wanted
good,
to mention
okay.
that.
As good as you? I don't know. You've done an awesome job.
Maybe better.
Oh, she's got a tough mentor to follow. Seriously though, you've been an outstanding minute taker, and some of this stuff up here is so convoluted. I don't know how in the world you can get it straight. Anyway, let's move right along. Next order of business is the code amendments related to the coastal construction control line. Shall we start with staff comments, please? Brian?
Good morning.
Oh, Wayne.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. The first step was establishing what our existing codes look like in terms of the eastward line and monitoring the setback requirements for east of the coastal construction line. Unfortunately, our codes don't really address much in that light, except for the 25-foot setback from the warder's way or the warder's edge. One of the thoughts on this morning's discussion is looking at the introduction of an ordinance to that effect or address some of those issues. 2019-01, which can be found in the package. So at this time, I'll open this up for discussion.
Well, help me understand, please. We have the 1979 control line, right? Which is,
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, you may want to have Lisa Tropepi kind
Oh.
of talk about that a little bit and explain the map and
Oh,
and
thank
do
you.
some things like that.
Good morning.
I need the explanation.
That's
Thanks.
fine. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning and Zoning Board. In your packet is a 24 by 36 aerial photograph of the entire town. Along the east side, and this was as per your request at the last meeting, we plotted two lines. The yellow line is the coastal construction control line of 1979. That historically, actually, we've somewhat used that line as what we would call a setback line back in the day. The purple line, or magenta, or whatever, is the coastal construction control line of 1997. So that's obviously more current. If you look at the line, however, it is definitely over 100 feet, in some cases further to the west. So when we historically used to talk of the yellow line as some kind of a setback line, the line then changed to the purple line, and now we pretty much use it as a control line for the DEP's jurisdiction as to whether they review plans or not.
Well, we couldn't build houses like we've been building for 100 years because of the purple line, right? If we were to follow the purple line, we couldn't build houses as close as we have over the years to the shore.
No.
No,
That's
I think the purple line or the more current line is more of a jurisdictional line for the state to review any improvements to the east of that line. So the yellow line, they weren't really reviewing much, and now they are reviewing more.
Yeah, the state,
And Mark can talk more
No,
about that
thank you,
too
Mark.
as an architect.
that's their reference line. They won't deny you doing development east of that line, but they will use that line as a negotiation to negotiate what's reasonable. But there's no denial of any construction east of the coastal control line. And its points of reference, they use proximity to adjacent properties, how far east they are. They make an alignment. So the best word to use is negotiate, because there's no hard set rule or.
Well, Mark, is the 1979 yellow line, on the other hand, an absolute line?
It's a recorded line, on surveys as indicated here. It's not disappearing. It's being maintained because, as you see in the package, some of the municipalities use that as a rear setback line. So that's, I think, one of the items we need to look at. That, Gulfstream, and God, if I say that name one more time, run me out of here, please. They do, use that as their rear setback line, which I think in our case is going to be very penalizing, because we have a lot more properties, smaller properties, adjacent to the ocean. So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the discussion was to try to come up with a reasonable offset or setback for new development, so it doesn't seem to be encroaching or impeding, the beach area.
And have we, staff, had issues that gives rise to this item coming before us? Or is this something that you think we ought to take a look at? Have there been problems, in other words, that we're reacting? Are we reacting to problems, or are we reacting to theoretical future problems?
Mr. Chair, just to clarify that, this is a request that came from the town commission for
Yes,
you
I
all to
understand.
look at this as a possible line of demarcation that you could use for the purpose of gauging your setbacks, et cetera, to address growth that has extruded past that into the seaward side. As Mark indicated, this is a jurisdictional line. DEP negotiates everything east of the purple line there by jurisdiction. There's a desire by members of the commission to consider more restrictive setbacks than exist under state statute and DEP rulings. So that's really the essence of this discussion as to whether this town wants to look at taking that yellow line and making it a place where we draw our line, so to speak, and then do our measurements or amend code to actually use that as a stopgap, a backstop, if you will, against moving more seaward on development.
Doesn't the purple line also entail construction code recommendations
Yes.
that are unique in that particular zone?
You have to pile your structure, put it on piles. That's mandatory.
Correct, and I think it had wind mitigation and
Well,
water
that's part of the
mitigation.
whole. Actually, it's not so much wind, it's just washout or scour.
Do we follow all those recommendations, or have we turned any of them into requirements, or is that an issue for us to be looking at?
Well, everything east of the coastal control line, the new one, the purple, has to go to Tallahassee to be reviewed. And they will review it in terms of piling. Again, that's the only thing. Frangible and piling are the two elements that they look for. The whole coastal protection is not about wind or anything. It's all about scour. the 100-year scar
What
from
does
the wind.
frangible mean?
Frangible means if you have a seawall or a basement element or any kind of structure, every 5 feet has to have
It breaks
a
away.
expansion joint so that it could blow out or wash out. So those are the only criteria that Tallahassee really looks at. You know, the hurricane impact criteria dealt with by the building department.
Essentially, right now, we look at the zoning aspects east of that line, but the building, all the building code and technical stuff comes from the state DEP and the building code.
Right, and I think, Mr. Chair, kind of going back to your earlier question there, just one of the issues that I've noticed in your code, it doesn't seem to be a clear-cut definition for how you determine lot size on some of those lots that back up to the ocean. And so that's one thing that we would probably be looking to clarify, possibly, that line. Because there's a lot line that could go out into the ocean, into the sandy area, and we know that we don't take into account all of that property as far as your lot size determinations, and so we might need to do some work on that. The other thing is that I believe as far as the setbacks go, I think the commission was also kind of looking at, well, are there other mitigating factors? If you want to allow someone to continue to possibly build where they're building now or we're close to it, what are some other mitigating factors that you might want to place on some of the, in our code? Because there's nothing in our code now, whether it's vegetation on the dune or some other things. I know, and just a couple of examples of some of the code sections here, that one of them talks about a few mitigating factors, but that's just another thought as well.
So the problem, as I see it, is we need to be careful. What are the unintended consequences of what we might do? And I would really appreciate some professional input as to what, if anything, we should be doing up here.
Well, one of the things that you just be mindful of, before a CCCL application is looked at in Tallahassee, they first ask the jurisdiction, your zoning requirements, do you have any objections based on what's going to be looked at? And that is kind of part of the discussion here, if we want to put certain limitations as far as setbacks in place before it goes up to Tallahassee. Some of the languages, and you've asked me, this is a separate but interrelated discussion, was other issues that's prevalent in the code that we could look at, and one of those are the definition of usable buildable lot. That in of itself is kind of problematic the way it is, and it leaves rise to overdevelopment or just a reaching area. So those are the kind of things that we would want to be able to take a look at. As the vice chair indicated, the 1979 line, the yellow one, even though it is a great benchmark, it may provide a bit of difficulty for quite a few of the properties because of just based on where the development currently sits and being able to prohibit all construction just east of that line. So some kind of a modification, that's a great benchmark, the 1979 line, but we need to take a closer look at that.
Can I ask you?
No, please. I'm sorry.
Would we want to develop a setback based on the yellow line?
Well, that's just the thing.
I mean, DEP controls everything from Purple Line East, right?
Well, that is correct.
So we want to determine our town setback.
That is what we're trying to set back. The most easterly portion, where are we defining it as? And currently, the closest thing that we have to anything as far as establishing no construction is 25 feet from the water's edge. That's it. And that's not much to work with. And that's why we're having this discussion now in terms of seeing what else can be put in place. Other jurisdictions have gone as far as saying no construction east of the dunes. So, it gets really restrictive depending upon your topography. It's very hard to make those kind of statements from an established community which is pretty much built out already. However, as I said, we still need to have some kind of a guidelines, whatever that number is.
Could we develop a setback based on the yellow line that doesn't totally shut down
True,
development
true.
along the
We
beach?
could even have said from the water's edge, we could say 75 feet.
Yeah, but we said
Or-
water's edge is problematic. The yellow
Yeah,
line
well,
is
yeah,
something
yeah.
on the, that
That
we
is-
all can agree on.
That is correct. That is correct. That is correct.
If
Yes,
I
we
may
could.
add to that, Mr. Hutchins, we've seen over the years here, many of the lots and the plats along the ocean front of this town end at different places and protrude out different distances. So looking at the yellow line as a common demarked area, that could deal or help deal with the calculations we do. So we've had pushback by the calculations and how they're handled by the zoning officials and others in terms of determining FAR and pervious areas and all kinds of things that affect the oceanfront development that might be better clarified by taking something like the yellow demarked line there and using it as a basis for X number of feet, one direction or another from it, in a zoning sense, so that when it went to DEP, they'd go, okay, you check off everything here, but according to local zoning code, you exceed the calculations by going seaward of that line for
Sounds
whatever
good
it
to me.
is.
Well,
Well, the difficulty is, as I mentioned earlier, we have so many variables in terms of lot size on the ocean. Adjacent communities are usually what they term estate lots or bigger lots. Again, Gulfstream, Manalapan, Palm Beach, most oceanfront properties are quite substantial size. We have pockets here that are very small, and I think it would be, unfair to come up with a magic figure that's universal for everybody, because it will create some real hardships for some of these properties.
thank you, Mark. Well, for example, we have a beach house, the McCormick Mile Beach House. It's over even the yellow line.
Yeah.
We could not add, as we did, a patio to that beach house. We did it, and it was, I got the approval from the state, it was sort of like wink, wink. I'm sorry, but it was crazy at the time. Well, I'm still having a hard time. Do you have a number, a setback number that you'd like to put on the table for us to consider? A yellow line setback number, let me just be more specific.
We get it, what you're saying. So, like, it would be easy to just say some number out there. You can't go beyond so many feet of the 1979 control line. The problem is you've got whole lots east of the 1979 line. So
Right.
how do you do that?
Right.
Cause a setback line to be in place and not hurt someone's property rights?
And picking up on what Mark said, and I think you're just piggybacking on that thought. We have so many different exceptions already that I'm gonna suggest maybe we just ought to look at every oceanfront lot improvement or construction on a case-by-case basis. And not try to come up with a magic number, one size fits all.
Then you have no teeth. You have no.
You want to take public comment,
Yeah,
Mr.
you want,
Chairman,
yeah, public comment?
rather than comments from the audience?
We have a recording.
Good morning. Christine DeHaas at 29 Sable Island Drive. A little further background is, the other reason that this is being brought before you is we as a commission and you eventually as planning and zoning are starting to redo our comprehensive plan, and the coastal element is the first part of the comprehensive plan by state regulations that we need to bring up to code. And the coastal element has a lot to do with where you can build and how you can build and other things like that. So that's another further reason as we're taking a look at this. I'm presuming in your package you got Mr. Minor's information about the coastal construction line and some other things?
Yes.
Yes. So that's the basis for it. You have to have some baseline because it is well and good to say case-by-case basis, and I totally understand what you're saying, but maybe you have a case-by-case basis, not unlike we have in our building codes. We have different building codes and different FAR for smaller lots down in the south end, and then for a standard size lot, we have a different FAR. So that might be another way to kind of look at it, is look at it, you know, if it fits neatly in dividing into 3 sections, really large lots, medium-sized lots, and then, like you said, some of our completely non-conforming smaller lots. But at some point, if we don't put a line in the sand, then we are gonna just continue to repeat what we do, which is build over any line. And I don't think that that's probably what we want as a town, so.
Well, may I ask, what is that line in the sand that makes sense?
I don't know if it's based on line, and I would defer more to Marty, because he's got this, you know, the expertise. I would say it would be more relevant to look at potentially water's edge, but that, you know, that changes on a 5-foot basis at any point in time. So it is more about making sure that structures like 5001 on North Ocean Boulevard do not happen again in our town. And if we just say, well, we'll look at it, no offense, but whoever's sitting in that seat will look at it, and they'll have all the power to say yay or nay, and then it will go forward. And
And which one is 5001 North Ocean Boulevard?
That's the duplex property at the southeast corner of the
Gotcha.
town
You can
bordering
see it on the
Brian
map.
Breeze's.
You can see it there, yeah.
You can clearly see it on the
See it
map.
Right, okay,
on this
good,
map,
thank you.
it's the one that
Fully.
sticks out on the south.
Good. Any other public comment?
Good morning. Martin Wischolek, 5 Angle Drive. I think you got my address. I think the most important thing in this whole discussion is how many properties are actually really negatively impacted if we use the yellow line. There was a reason why that yellow line was established. It was established back in the day in 1979 because that was where the state saw this is a potential problem line. This is where we need to make sure that construction is being controlled by us. And I think it's a reasonable line. The purple line is probably the more accurate line as to where they really need to be looking at today with sea level rise. And technically, if we're really honest with each other, the purple line is pretty much the line where no construction should be happening east of it. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Obviously, this is not what we could discuss. But I think off the yellow line, this is like the minimum line that we need to look at. Now, how many properties are being impacted by that? Really negatively impacted, where they either could not build or would have a significant impact where they could not build. And the only thing that I can think of is that south end, that duplex property. And then you have on Old Ocean Boulevard, you have this little stretch of houses that sits, I think it's 7 or 8 houses that sits between Anna Street and Corinth. Those are the only houses that are really on the east side of it. Everything off that is on the other side of Ocean Boulevard, of Old Ocean Boulevard. So those properties would not really be impacted on a great basis. So we're talking about 7, 8 homes that have a direct impact. Figure out how we can give an exception to these houses. And besides that, if for whatever reason somebody's property gets impacted, major hurricane happens, they get wiped out, they have a right to rebuild anyway. You're not taking away their right to rebuild. They have a right to rebuild. So they can rebuild whatever structure was there at the same spot where it was. They just cannot knock it down and rebuild something entirely different. So your thing here today is make make a line as to this is where we do not allow construction in order to protect this town and to protect the impact on this town. That's really what it comes down to. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
I want to ask a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that was a point well taken. Would it be possible to look at non-conforming properties as they relate to the yellow line and create a new setback that may be rather irregular, but would allow them the same privilege as anyone else?
I think what kind of, based on this discussion, I believe what staff is kind of hearing is that maybe we try to take a look at the different zoning districts, kind of going on what the vice chair was talking about, and then look at grandfathering in. It would be kind of hard to do it irregular based on what's there now, but if we look at grandfathering in, you know, where certain structures, based on also the last speaker there, I mean, you know, depending on if you still follow our grandfathering clauses in our code, you know, you're still going to be able to build, but if you decide to go brand new on something, then you're going to have to come up to meet the code on everything. But we take a look at that, and then possibly the different zoning districts for different setbacks that would be more applicable to different lot sizes. So if you want staff to kind of, you know, give that direction for staff to take a look at that. I know we're focusing on setbacks here, but I didn't know also if the board had any comments on, you know, mitigating factors for, you know, or if you wanted staff to kind of further research that topic as well, if, you know, if we're allowing, you know, to get a setback of this distance or whatever, you also need to do X, Y, and Z.
Yes,
I appreciate the town's attorney comments, because I think we need to take some approach like that we do create something that is more standard than 25 feet from the water's edge. That doesn't give our staff a good guideline on how to review things. And if we can come up with a method based on the zoning that takes into account some of these smaller lots, that'd be excellent. And I would fully support that. The other thing that I believe came up when it was before the commission was accessories besides the main structure. What do we want to do with swimming pools? What do we want to do with other accessory buildings that might go along? So the staff's going to need to address those things also. Are there things that will be allowed beyond the yellow line, but using the yellow line as the setback for the main structure? Or do we want, you know, everything to be set back at that yellow line? So there's more staff work that needs to be done here.
Isn't that as simple as just saying that the yellow line is your setback line?
In some cases, it's an entire lot.
Well, and then,
Because if you
I'm
see
not sure we want to slice this up into, you know, 7 or 9. You know, wouldn't the owners then have the right to come and appeal through a special exception or something where you do have a hardship
Well, right now it'd be a variance.
or a variance?
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, if
And-
they have a legitimate variance, which is, you know, you have very expensive property that you can't use, you know, there's legitimate hardships, but you take it case by case. I just can't see how we're going to create a formula that's going to meet everybody's, you know, situation.
And that's my problem as well, except that maybe the point about mitigation is something we could focus on and maybe come up with mitigating factors that might allow for I'll make this up, a swimming pool, for example. And if those mitigating factors are considered and met, well, that might be a reason, a discretionary reason to allow the swimming pool, as a for example. But certainly, and I'm with Mark, the yellow line is the absolute setback line, period. I don't know how we can,
Well,
if there's one magic answer that,
further to that history, because I was here when this 79 line was established. It was established to protect the coastal zone. I mean, it was again, I keep mentioning the washout. So obviously, back then, the state felt that that was a very sacred area to protect. So all we're doing is using that criteria to establish, you know, a setback line for our easterly development.
right. Period.
Not creating another setback on top of that or
Right.
off of that. Because any establishment, you go 10 foot, 15, 25 feet, how do you slice it up? How do you
Right.
share it up?
And then I would hate to have staff do some more work on something that would be a fool's errand, so to speak.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to be blunt about it, but I just don't see any sense in coming up with anything other than the yellow line as being a mandatory setback line. However, if there are hardship circumstances, as Mark said, you can appeal for a variance. So, what's wrong with that?
So would that allow for, because a lot of these things along the shoreline are knockdowns. And would that, if somebody buys a existing place, knocks it down, do they get the same ability through a variance to build out to the same position as before? Or are they now limited to the yellow line?
That's a, you know,
Because that's what's going on there. I mean, there's,
yeah, but that's a decision that the owners have to make. I mean, it's, you know, we can't determine that as a town.
no, but I think it's a valid question.
Oh, it is a valid question, but that's up to the individual as to how, you know, there are a lot of homes that are renovated or actually upgraded to meet the criteria of, say, piling. The
Right.
state, for example, if you have an existing house, you can actually modify the foundation within that envelope, and you don't even need a permit. So there's criteria there. It's a lot of technical stuff, but I think if, sorry, go ahead.
Right.
No, finish your thought, please.
No, I'm just saying, it's up to the owner. I mean, if they know they can't build past that yellow line, they have to make a business decision whether they're gonna risk tearing down an existing structure or modify the existing structure if it's non-conforming.
Might I ask the attorney, just for clarification, if you were to hypothetically establish the yellow line as a setback line, what would become the legal status of all the properties that currently protrude past that? In terms of their footprint, their grandfathered status, their
Well, I mean, they,
ability to expand nonconformities, whatever the case may be.
that they would be legally non-conforming, but I guess my question is, and I know you talk about the yellow line as the setback line, is it, I guess it seems like what I'm hearing though is the yellow line, you cannot build anything eastward of the yellow line. Is that kind of what I'm hearing? That's what you're saying?
That's one point of reference.
Okay, but is it, you know, in looking at the map, there are some places on the map where it seems like the buildings and the structures go right up to the yellow line and then stop. However, there's some other places where it appears that there's quite a bit of an area between the yellow line and the structure itself. So I guess I just want to try to be clear, is the direction to say no? You're referring to the yellow line as the setback line, but is that the line that is, there's a zero setback off the yellow line, then people can build right up to it? Or is it, no, we want to allow, we want to look at this to say, well, it's 5 feet off the yellow line, or something like that? I guess I'm just trying to get clarification.
I think it's like any of our other zoning districts. The estate lots very well could have different setbacks than the smaller lots. And I would certainly hate to see a mammoth structure on a state lot right up on that yellow line. So we have to have a little more staff input here. But if you as the attorney are comfortable that the direction we're taking isn't going to involve us in a lot of lawsuits. That certainly the town doesn't want to take on trouble.
And that's why maybe we need to have staff kind of look at this a little bit more. I certainly understand what you're saying, reference to the yellow line and everything, but maybe there is something that that staff might want to take a quick look at some things in different zoning districts, depending on how much setback should there be in a particular zoning district, if that's applicable. It may not be. But to my knowledge, I don't think staff has really looked at this, because I think you just come up with a map on Thursday, okay, or something, or Wednesday, or sometime like that. So that's the reason this is, kind of coming to you without a whole lot of staff input.
Well, not only that, but the professional planner hasn't had a chance to weigh in either, because it hasn't been directed for planning purposes yet either.
Well, and Lisa, thank you, it's a great map and a huge help. But I go back to my first question. Is there a real problem that we are reacting to, or are we merely addressing a theoretical problem? Yes, please, we have a...
What we have is the ability and development that's taken place that can be built to the maximum. With the current zoning as it stands, you can expect this to continue. And the recommendation just from DEP and why they established the CCCL line and why the 1970 line was established was to prevent construction going past the dunes. Structurally, the home is better protected on the western side of the dune versus being easterly open to the elements, wave action, scourging, so on and so forth. So to answer your question, there are structures that already exist that were recently built. Structures that are under construction have been built to the maximum, and with the possibilities of future tear-down structures that's maybe taking place, it may be prudent at this point, because you need to establish something. It takes a while to get something established. It's not going to happen overnight, but I do believe that we need to take a closer look at establishing a setback line, whatever that is.
Thank you, Wayne. Yes, please.
Visual again. There's two houses I think that you should look at as a reference. One house which sits on that stretch between Anna and Corinth has just been renovated.
Yes.
Was an existing structure, was an old existing structure. I think it was a wood structure, if I remember correctly. And they took that down. They started renovating it, and then I think in the entire process of it, decided, you know what, let's do this, and then went up with masonry walls and changed the entire thing. That is a perfect example of what you can do with an existing structure, renovating an existing structure, making it safe, making it more compatible to being an oceanfront structure on an existing lot. And that, to one of your comments, there's a 50% rule. So when you're renovating a house, everything that is under 50% renovation or renovation cost, you do not have to comply with existing codes. You can just renovate the house. Once you go past that, now you have to comply with everything else. So there's means and ways how to take an existing building and renovate it properly to make it more modern, make it more livable, make it whatever you want. You can change the facade of it, you can change the style of it, you can do a lot of things to a building and make it more suitable for whoever wants to move in there. That's one example. The other example is the extreme example. It's one of the estate lots just up the street here, south of Ocean Avenue. What I assume is going to be the Ocean Ridge Shopping Mall. So 3, 4, 5. The parking garage is towards you. So this is an example of where you take a lot size and you just draw, this is my maximum footprint that I can go with, and you design a building that fits right onto that thing. This is what we need to prevent from happening. And the other one is the options that we have with the structures that are not compliant. And this, Anna to Corinth, would be one of those areas where it's not compliant. So keep in mind that when you're making these decisions, I know we're looking at the oceanfront properties right now, and we're looking at properties that will have a negative impact on it. And I understand that if you own a lot, doesn't matter if it's an estate lot, if it's a small lot. If you own a piece of property that you're paying property taxes on, and somebody comes and says, well, you know what, you can't build this much anymore, now you can only build less. You're actually impacting the property value of that property. I get that. However, the dune is the security for everything else that sits behind it. So all the properties that sit behind it are impacting by whatever is on that dune. So if we allow people to encroach into that dune and to make that dune unsafe in case of a hurricane, we're impacting all the properties behind it. And that should be a part of our consideration too when we make these discussions. So a hard line and a line that sometimes impacts somebody else saves a lot of other people.
Good, thank you. So my takeaway so far is, everybody's suggesting, excuse me, Don.
Don Magruder, 9 Ridge Boulevard. I have 3 words, sea level rise.
I knew you were coming up.
I knew I was gonna bring
Feel
that up.
it's floating up here.
But we're talking 30 years out or so, but it's happening. And so by establishing a line here, you're kind of giving yourself some protection down the road. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mark.
It's all right.
Mark?
I'm just thinking here, it's to the point, and I think the fear is the estate lots are the larger lots. I mean, one option may be to come up with a formula that you can, if you're over 15,000 square feet or 20,000 square feet, there may want to be a required setback. In other words, as Mike just mentioned, we don't want to see that parking garage again. And I think that just slipped through a number of cracks. So that's an unusual, but it's a good, unfortunate, it's a living example. But, maybe lots over, let's say 15,000 feet require 10 feet, 20 feet, I don't know what the reasonable. Because if you have more property, obviously you can respond to setback criteria. It's when you're less than that, I think it's penalizing to impose that on people. So that may be one thing. And Marty, I don't know if you're going to be dragged into this, but there may be some kind of fluctuating scale.
Well, I think where we are is that everybody's in agreement that something ought to be done. The question is, what is that something? And I haven't heard an answer yet. So perhaps what we do is we, without creating a monster of a task, throw it back to staff and our professional consultants and ask them if there are specific recommendations that they have that we could address, as opposed to just some general request for input. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's, just don't do 25, all right?
So
Right.
do they have anything that they would add today
Yeah,
in
you
that
have-
direction?
Yeah, is there a something that,
We just welcome the opportunity to take a little look at this and bring it back.
fair enough.
Yeah, maybe, I think looking at the zoning districts and maybe quantifying the number of lots that are in its totality on the east side of this 1979 line, to see if we are in fact creating a situation where they can't build anything. If we can quantify, now that we know where the line is and we understand that that the board is considering using that 1979 line as some kind of a demarcation setback type of line. Let us take a look at and quantify by zoning area how we would address each of those areas with respect to the lots east of that line.
Sure.
We haven't done that yet because the first task was to create is to show the line. Now that we can see the line, we can see that we have substantial improvements already on some of those areas, and also vacant lots where we can move forward and possibly put in some restrictions that address the environment and the situation in the future.
Take a look at and in particular, take a look at the McCormick Mile Beach House.
Right.
It shouldn't be there if you use the yellow line as a point of reference. It's just that simple.
You got it there.
Okay,
Right.
let's move on. Do we need to take any action?
Yeah, you should have some sort of consensus or motion to have the contracted planner and staff look at the issues and bring it back to the planning and zoning for review.
Consensus? Okay, good enough consensus. We all agree?
Impact
We're gonna-
relative to the yellow line.
Yes. Good, thank you. Moving right along. Comprehensive plan. Staff input, please.
Good morning. For the record, Marty Miner with Urban Design Kilday Studios. For the past year, we've been working on revising the town's comprehensive plan regarding the coastal management element to address sea level rise. That is a state requirement. And during this process, we've had a lot of good discussions, and that has spilled over into other elements of the comprehensive plan. So we were directed, staff and the consultants, to get together to bring about other suggested amendments. And this is a workshop. We're here to get your feedback. I will be back before you with a final version of this. But before you today, on the future land use element, we've updated the population estimates that were done. Currently, there's about 1,800 people within the town. Most of these elements and adjustments, based on the discussions we've been having, talk about redevelopment and policies that guide the redevelopment and environmentally sensitive areas. We defined environmentally sensitive areas in the new conservation element in here. We require within the conservation element and the future land use element that if you develop within a environmentally sensitive area, you have mangroves, you have hammocks, that you have to provide an environmental assessment. That allows the town to be able to analyze what is being proposed. It's not a requirement. This is a pretty standard requirement in other communities, especially communities that have sensitive environmental resources. So we've required the environmental assessments. Also within the future land use element, we've echoed a coastal management element policy that redevelopment has to address resiliency against sea level rise, how things are being addressed. Also, any kind of new streets that become created within the town, that they would have to meet this right-of-way standards that's found in the code. Another fairly standard requirement that wasn't covered here in the town's comprehensive plan. Coastal management element, we've been working on that. We've done a little tweaking regarding, once again, identifying the environmentally sensitive areas. If you're developing on or redeveloping along the ocean, you have to provide a dune vegetation analysis, sort of ways to provide more information for town staff to do their analysis and recommendations. Within the coastal management element, we proposed policy 2.17. That was a list of things that the town had decided to, should study in relationship to sea level rise. We've added to that, one was the seawall heights within the town, and for what we've just been discussing, the coastal construction line. As you can see, there is a lot of issues that play with that, and some of those things that we need to study is basically game it out. Under the current rules, this is what you can do on this policy, and game it out with the other possible options. Once again, conservation easements.
Excuse me.
Yeah, go
What do you
ahead.
mean by game it out?
Game it out. Let's say, so we look at a lot, an oceanfront lot, what can we do now? What can we build? We can do this, max it out. And then, well, what if we made this line, we, go from there? How does that change the equation? That's how, just looking at that as possible ways of identifying the impacts or unintended consequences of such proposals. Once again, thank you. Other things added on here, the sprinkler systems within the town should have a water sensing device. That is fairly standard, but it should be within the comprehensive plan. Once again, the environmentally areas have been identified, and in any wetland-related development, we've had, they would have to adhere to the standards of the South Florida Water Management Department, DEP, Treasure Coast, Army Corps of Engineers, and the Palm Beach County Department of Environmental Resource Management. Then the final element that we're proposing to change at this time is the recreation and open space. Updated population projections there. Added a policy that for the town to encourage land donations or financial contributions to recreational opportunities in the town, and a provision that for new plan developments or new subdivisions, that a park land dedication of 600 square feet per dwelling unit be provided. And that's new dwelling units. So if you're taking 3 or 4 lots and but they're large and you're combining them to 8 lots. And so you would do, those 4 additional lots would be required to provide 600 square feet per house as recreational. There's also a money buyout provision offered on this, that if it's a small area, the developer would make that contribution as like an impact type fee to the town for recreational opportunities.
So, are you done?
Yes.
So Marty, it sounds like, it all sounds like common sense, good future thinking, and nothing onerous.
That was the guiding principle moving forward.
And in your opinion, is there anything onerous?
No, there is not.
Okay. So, any board comment or public comment, or should we move on? Just say yes, go for it.
It is a workshop, so any kind of comments you have, this will come back to you in an ordinance form.
I had a couple questions,
Yeah.
Marty. I'm looking under future land use element, and on Objective 4, Policy 4.1, and it's talking about land containing flora and fauna that are endangered, threatened, or special concern. And could you give us an existing example of places that meet that at this point in time? I'm just curious, because it's a laudable thing, but I just want to have something that I can look at here in town and say, yeah, that's right.
Once you were looking at your map, there are several large mangrove areas, and incorporates several different, multiple property owners. And those type of properties that would fall into that flora and fauna that would be protected, you would have to go, if someone was gonna go in and you have some of the green area out there, before any kind of development goes on, they'd have to provide an environmental assessment now. That's what we're proposing. And this would, identify any of that flora, fauna, protected species that are out there.
Okay.
We suspect they're out there. I don't know they're out there for sure, but I highly suspect it based on the communities around it.
Okay. I'd like to ask you another question. I'm
Yeah.
looking under Objective 6, restrict development to 1730 dwelling units in the entire town.
Yes.
Then I go down to Policy 6.3, and it says, "Single-family residential future land use designation shall have a maximum density of 3 dwelling units per acre." Acres 43,560 square feet, so that predicates a lot that's 14,500 feet. So we have a lot of lots in town that are smaller than that, and I try to represent them. Just kind of explain that to me. Is that if we have a big blowout and things are
Yes.
rebuilt?
If things are rebuilt, a big blowout, or someone buys up a lot of small lots and start assembling land together, these would govern that.
So,
For the density, for the single-family units,
uh-huh.
and then the overall number of units.
Okay, so let's say one house burns down,
Yeah?
and it's got to be replaced. Does this 14,500 square foot lot thing control that?
It would be rebuilt as is. It is a identified lot. You're not changing.
So that would be a variance from what you're proposing here?
You can rebuild.
You can rebuild,
You can rebuild.
okay. Well,
But
just,
if you're trying-
all I'm trying to do is get
Yeah,
clarification,
no,
because I actually took the
appreciate
time
that.
to
I
read it.
appreciate that, and I'm just making sure we're all talking the same language here.
Okay. I'm not trying to monopolize things, I want to be quick so we can get out of here, but on the coastal management element, encourage boat users to reduce speeds in the town's waterways. So I think later on that was discussed that local police would contact Marine Patrol or somebody.
If there's a considered issue,
Right.
if there's something in mind that could be done, education-wise, a brochure encourages.
Is this
people.
suggesting that we adopt an idle speed in the waterway?
I think, I'm not sure the town can do that.
It's
I
outside our
believe they
jurisdiction.
can encourage.
It's outside our jurisdiction
Yeah.
entirely.
Yep.
But it's one of those intergovernmental coordinations, we deal with state, various departments, DOT, all the time, so.
Thank you for explaining things.
Good points, Dave, excellent points, thank you. Any other public comment or staff comment? And if not, is there any action that we should be taking at this point in time?
Just directing Marty to go over that and present that in ordinance format for you at the next meeting, and at that point, it will go for public hearing.
Yes. Do we have consensus on this board that we want to direct our town planner to proceed with ordinance preparation and presentation at a future meeting?
Agreed.
Agree? We all agree?
Fine.
Okay. Moving on to item number 4, P and Z Authority on concept plan review applications. This is something that's been a big question over the last couple of years, and we're finally doing something about it. So, staff, please,
Marty's up on this one again for
good. Thank you, Marty.
his input.
Good evening, good morning, excuse me. Hasn't gone that late yet. This had been a topic of discussion for a while here. I was directed to look into this, and I looked at specifically section 35, is it 6356? The concept development review process, where that is where traditionally you've been providing comments, suggestions, but it really didn't have any kind of teeth. I've kept that same kind of format and a lot of that criteria, but given the authority for approval of single families and two-family structures to this board. You wouldn't be making recommendations, you would actually approve, deny, approve with conditions, or request additional information when someone comes before you with a house structure or two-family structure. The criteria is largely what you've been using before. I've added a couple other criteria. The height and scale of the proposed structure shall be compatible with the surrounding neighborhoods. That's one of the new criteria I've added. It sort of it helps define the consistency of the structure with the neighborhood. Also, some basic things like architectural style is carried out throughout the house, the whole structure, and the structure meets all the land development regulations and your comprehensive plan. It helps set this criteria for the review, and but provides the opportunity for you, this board, to use their expertise to make a decision. Anyone can, the folks here can make appeals, and those appeals to any of your decisions would go to the town commission. If you have any questions?
I have two. First is why is it limited to single family and duplex, not all applications? What's different about multifamily and why is it not included?
It's a good question. I was just looking at the conceptual development review process, which identifies, is limited to the single and two-story families. I really didn't even look at the multifamily.
On the multifamily, if I can jump in here, a multifamily, I think, and Tracy or Jamie can correct me if I'm wrong, but that would be considered a major permit application that already triggers then site plan review approval. Off the top of my head, I can't tell you exactly where that would go, but that might be directly to in front of the commission. And maybe that's another thing, if we make this change here, we may want to have that, have them come in front of you first. I don't know, but I think in our code already, it goes to them for review of the site plan. So there is site plan review on those particular things. And so the concept plan review just dealt with this stuff here.
Thank you.
Because it's a minor permit process in our
That's
code.
correct.
Thank you.
And the other one that I think is real significant is the 50% threshold. I know there's 50% thresholds on other reconstruction criteria and stuff, but when we're talking about design elements, and a lot of what takes place here in the town is major renovations, and we can all drive by some that were done wonderfully and some that weren't. To set this threshold, or loophole as I would view it, to do a 49% change, and that 49% completely changed the front elevations and elements and created parapets and all the things that we've been concerned about because they stayed under the threshold, it doesn't make sense to me.
Okay. This is an existing criteria that determines what comes before you for the conceptual review. We can look at that. That is.
It makes sense to me, Rick. You know, not everyone can afford to knock down a place and build a new one. And that's, I believe, the basis of this concept. I would like to, just for a point of clarification, this is an appraised value, is it not, Marty? When we come to the 50%?
Yes.
So people have the ability to stay within the confines of that, and now their house appraises for something different than it was before, and they can revisit it later point in time and work off of that basis point.
But I think, we're trying to accomplish a number of things, but one of it is the consistency with the community and matching the neighborhood. So if we allow someone to do, and they could do it in multiple elements, they can change that home without having the design review that we were looking for here. We're not talking about restricting somebody's ability to do something. It's a question of whether they bring it before us and meet the criteria that would be expected of any other construction
So
in the
you're
town.
suggesting for any renovation?
There obviously is a threshold, but 50% is a high threshold. Or you could write it another way, the ones that would have a change of the elevations of the house.
Or where it's
Mostly we're
visible
talking about
from the
street
public
view.
right-of-way is.
Yeah, we're talking about street view and height.
Good.
Those are the two things that I think most of the people, the complaints that come in are, why did you let this monstrosity get built here? Why is that, that take place? And if you could do a new front facade with a parapet wall of 35 feet and be under 50%, and really change the street view of what that neighborhood saw.
No, I think that's correct.
Great
I think it should just be a blanket. Any renovation or addition to the structure has to come
Good.
front. That's what most other people have. It's, the 50% is getting a little bit protracted here in the value. That's really for,
I mean, could we
Yeah, it's-
separate
it's not an
internal
aesthetic
versus
thing, it's a-
external?
pardon?
You're saying any renovation, could we separate internal versus external? That if there's an external change made? we
Any
just review it?
external, it's any external change. I'm not answering for it because I had the
Yeah,
same
I agree.
question. It's just any modification to the existing structure.
Good.
And it doesn't matter front, back, side. Yeah,
Good.
and it's just a check.
Yep.
But we're talking about the external
The
changes.
external.
Somebody wants to come
Right.
in and
They wanna
redo their
gut the inside
garage.
and
or-
turn
yeah,
Forget
interior-
that, that's
no,
not
you have
site
no-
plan.
No jurisdiction
But
on
it
that.
could be a 50%.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Right, right.
Good points.
That was one of mine. Are you finished?
I'm done.
I still request, please, that we can get the definition of similar and dissimilar.
Okay.
Because if this board is going to take on, which this is long overdue, the charge of, monitoring development, I would use a Palm Beach definition.
Okay.
Because, again, it works both sides. Similar, if we start to see a lot of homes that are kind of cookie cutters, we want to have the ability to, express an opinion on that, or vice versa if something is so peculiar and outstanding. So I think it'll just give us a little bit more
Yes.
Yeah.
basis for reference.
And Mark, do you see this as a step in the right direction?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Just want to make sure.
I've been working on this for all of us,
Right.
but
At least we're going,
yeah, I think it's still going to be an evolving process,
Right,
but I think
yes.
it gives us this, taking it from concept and actually
Right.
dealing with issues.
If I can, just a real quick question. I know you had kind of mentioned that you wanted to remove all thresholds, but an example, let's say if somebody comes in and wants to replace the window in the front of their home, and that's it, and say the mutton style's changing or something like that.
He has the
Okay.
authority to.
But I guess I'm
refer
trying to
us or
give
not.
Marty some insight in, I think there needs to be some sort of a minimum amount of work possibly that would trigger this coming in front of you all. Otherwise, staff would be kind of in a quandary of, well, do we take it to the board? Does it go to the building official? What do we do? That's my only
It's a
concern.
good question, but I think now we have Wayne on board, I think he can make that determination. All right, let's just use, if it's a plate glass window, big window, clear, no muttons, and they want to put in muttons, I think it's his judgment call whether he should put it, send it to us.
I hear you, and I trust Wayne implicitly. However, I guess there's just a question we may need to kind of, hate to use these words, but put something in there to kind of fetter his discretion on what comes in front of you and what he has the ability to say, no, this is okay, because everyone has a different point of view on what they consider is an important or not important. So I guess maybe if you could just maybe leave that kind of open where Marty could take a look at that to see if he can come up with something. He understands that the 50%, you don't like that, but maybe there's another threshold that we can come up with.
If I may, I just remind the board that the reason we're even here having this discussion was concerns in the past of discretionary decisions made by officials and staff members versus a review process. So that does need to be defined. And I would also like to comment for housekeeping purposes that the 50% rule is based on the improvements to the property as measured by the property appraiser's valuations, and it's aggregate over time. Is it a period of 5 years, Wayne?
5 years.
So if little additions and amenities are made to buildings and aggregate up to that 50% rule, that triggers this kind of review as well. For those who are concerned about people who might make little incremental changes until one day it's voila, a whole new building or house.
Good. Any other board comment? Any members of the public want to discuss this issue?
Also had something from Wayne.
Yes, please.
One quick one. As a suggestion to this, I fully agree with you with those 50%. And as an additional comment to that, you could come in and you can actually change the structure, the appearance of a structure for very, very little money. It is, you can go from a traditional ranch house into a modern looking structure in a matter of, I don't know, $10,000.
Sure. That's exactly what we're going to do.
And that is exactly what we need to prevent.
Exactly.
I agree with you.
Okay.
Suggestion, put a number to it, 10%. If you change the appearance more than 10% of the outside of the structure, you have to come in front of the P&Z. It's very hard. I think you're putting a lot of pressure on Wayne in this and just leaving it up to him. I'll give you an example of my house. When we renovated my house, we used to have this big bay window in the front. Used to have 3 rounded elements, and when we changed all the windows in the house, we cut those out and we made it square. That's an exterior change that I would have had to come in front of P&Z, but I'm very certain that you would not have any objections to making them a square instead of having these 3 rounded things on it. So if you go with a percentage, 10% change on the exterior.
But who values the percentage? You know, that's the.
You go by what is there, and then how many changes are you making? Does that come to, if you're just changing a window?
It's hard to
or if you-
quantify. I think any change, that's why I'm suggesting, and I don't mean to kind of broad brush this, but Wayne, that's a good, excellent example.
Yes.
He can make that judgment call. It's not going to impact the neighborhood. It's going to improve most likely.
Yeah, I think what Brian is going to is, if Wayne makes that judgment call based on my window, saying, yes, that's okay, and somebody else comes and says like, well, I have 2 windows too, and he says, you know what, I don't think so.
But then
You're creating a possibility of conflict, whereas if you have a clear,
All right, well, I don't know how you get 10%.
I have a solution. Let's quit screwing around with this. We've been going back and forth. Let's get it before the commission to make a decision. And we've got 3 changes on the table. And then Wayne, if it doesn't work, come back to us, and we can then make a further adjustment. But I don't know that there's any magic answer to 10% or dollars or anything. It's going to be a judgment call.
I just want to add that I'm in favor of some kind of guidelines. I don't want a blank situation to deal with. The code already addresses some portion of this, and if you want to use this as a guide, and that was one of my future discussions here, I'm in agreement with this moving forward. I'm just asking for, there has to be some kind of constraints that says, okay, if it's, and I'm gonna go, the figure in front of you, 64-2, if an elevation is articulated with a greater number or greater change of more than 8 by 16 area, then that has got to come back before concept plan review, something to that effect. Anything along those lines, at least there is some kind of a guideline to work by.
Mark?
I don't know.
Well, let's get this to the commission with, do any members of the public have any comment? Okay, let's get this to the commission. May I suggest that we include in our recommendation to the commission the following. Number one is Rick's point about anything and everything, any changes, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Any exterior.
Any
Can I-
exterior changes?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please. Dave.
So if I have a barrel tile roof and I want to replace it with a metal roof, does that fall under this?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
That seems pretty tight.
No.
What if people suddenly say we don't like metal roofs? And I'm just, this is hypothetical, I don't want to
No,
drag it
it's
out, but I think we're getting a little bit too tight on this.
It may not be appropriate for the style of the house. It's that simple. You know, and the owner needs to get some guidance. I mean, it's not, it may not be denied, but he may be asked to do something else to make it more suitable. That's a pretty major change.
It's a review process.
It's not that you're gonna be denied or, you know.
What if he wants the metal roof to be orange or green?
I mean,
That's,
Cocaine.
that's,
That's right, yeah.
that wasn't, right, and it's a good hypothetical point, but I don't know.
And again, it's a review process, there's an appeal process in connection with it, so therefore, it can ultimately come back to us for reconsideration with a different shade of orange, or it can go to the town commission for sustaining or approving. So you got two steps. And your point is well made, I'm not, I agree, it's, where does it become arbitrary and not? And I don't know the answer to that, but we gotta do something.
Would you like a motion?
Yes,
Oh, if I can, before I interrupt now, the direction you've given Mr. Minor here, I'm assuming that you want us to come back to this board at your next monthly meeting with a proposed ordinance, like this is the one that we're talking about going forward with what we're coming up with, as far as like to include anything and everything, you know, as far as that level and the certain criteria that we may need to have. I just want to ask that question.
well,
That would be the proper thing to do because you haven't even seen this in ordinance format yet. So typically what happens is you'll see it in ordinance format and then you will recommend that ordinance proceed to the town commission.
and I understand and appreciate that, and that's probably the answer. I just wanna make sure we're moving forward and not messing around with this anymore.
Right. So at your next
Exactly.
meeting, you'll see it in ordinance format and you
Yes.
can
Okay.
vote
Good,
yes or no.
So
please.
I'll make the motion that we ask the town attorney to prepare an ordinance and that it follows the guidelines in here, striking the 50% criteria limitations.
And adding anything else to it?
The definitions that,
yeah, and the two definitions.
Mr. Marshall.
The definitions that
Yeah, right.
Mark brought up.
The similar and
Similar.
dissimilar, and then to further kind of take into account your discussion that you've had here regarding having the decisions made by the building official versus something coming in front of you.
And is there a word or two we could add to help Wayne decide whether or not it should come back to us or not? It should come to us or not?
Well, I mean,
Only a
this,
word or two.
I don't know, because this kind of gets into, like, let's say a closer example of what Mr. Hutchins brought up. Let's say that somebody has architectural shingles on their home, and they want to change the color of those shingles. Does that come in front of you, or is that okay for Wayne to approve? See, it kind of gets into, those are the things that we're going to have to try to come up with some language to try to clarify. I'm assuming you all would think, well, if the color is not obtrusive, it would be okay for Wayne to approve it, and it doesn't need to come in front of you. Or is,
And therefore, you'd have to establish colors, a color
Well,
chart prior
I-
to.
Let
See-
me, again, just hate to continue to refer to other communities that have ARCOM, ARPB. What's normal, if staff is concerned, they usually reach out to the chair, I'm volunteering your time, to be a kind of a tiebreaker.
sounding board, something like that.
To
right.
see if you can do it, because, you know, I'm not saying that Wayne has to make that by himself, but he's definitely can reach out and get an opinion. So I'm just trying to stop housekeeping coming here, that's all.
Yeah.
And I'm open 24/7, Wayne.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we've got,
We have a motion, I think we need a second.
Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Good. Moving right along, the next item on the agenda is the parapet roof item. And, again, staff, I believe that would be Marty again, parapet roofs.
Yes, thank you. Another one of the topics we've been discussing is the flat roofs and limited parapet heights. As you know, the town code already limits flat roofs to 15% of the total roof area. With this proposal, we're proposing to limit the parapet that would screen this flat roof area to 24 inches. From the top of the tie beam to the top of the parapet would be limited to 24 inches, so you wouldn't have, you know, these long, elongated blank walls or parapet walls. This would not apply to the flat roofs for porches or decks. And looking at that, I've also recommended a similar type of restriction on section 6450, that any rooftop mechanical equipment shall be screened from view from adjacent properties. So these are two code revisions that we're proposing for you. Same type of thing. This is a workshop. Get your input, and we would be coming back in ordinance form.
Are you, is there anything in here that would change the prohibition of flat roofs?
No.
No, okay, you're
We're
just
talking about the
addressing the
parapet.
parapet wall.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a question for Marty. David, did you, go ahead.
Oh, you go first, might be the same question.
Okay. So our building height for single-family homes is 35 feet?
Yeah,
And this would, 36,
Mm.
and at 36, the 36-foot would remain the same under this?
That's correct.
So all you're saying is that the parapet portion of that 36-foot would be the top 2 feet? Is that?
Right,
I'm following.
if they
So-
have the flat roof all the
so,
way at the
but-
top.
The perception of a sloped roof house at 36 feet from the street or from the neighbor is much different than the perception of a 36-foot wall that goes up
Right.
at the face of that house. And I'm not in favor of 36-foot solid stretches up there. I think it changes. You put those two houses next to each other, they don't feel the same from the street or from, as a neighbor, and Mark probably can address this better than
Yeah,
I.
I think we need to give it a reference point, and commonly it's top of tie beam or bearing point.
It's indicated here.
That ensures that it doesn't get up any higher than 2 feet above the eave of a normal house.
But
Mr.
but even at that, you could push with our 36-foot criteria, you could push that tie beam height up to 33, is that?
Or
or
possibly. Well, we need to limit it to the, do we have, I'm so confused sometimes.
Top of the tie beam.
Top of the tie beam
It's
is,
indicated.
yeah, but Rick's point, if you have, say, a flat joist, then the tie beam is up at 34 feet.
So-
then you could have
I
another
think we
two.
need to define a max height of an exterior wall on a single-story residence, or that part of a building that's single-story. And then you have your 2-foot parapet, and
2 foot is correct.
you've limited the height.
You've got to have a point of reference on it. What is that? Don't we have a height for a maximum tie beam?
Yeah, there's height restrictions.
We have a
The
reference
the
for-
36 is
Maybe.
usually referred to that,
That's overall
rake
height.
itself.
That's overall height.
yeah.
The tie beam height's 24 on a 2-story,
Right.
So
That's-
2 feet above that, so you're up to 28.
Okay,
26.
so that would be, that would cover my concern is
Yes,
that
that's what I'm-
the highest, that
it's,
flat
that's still
element
monstrous.
would be 28 feet? Is that
26.
correct?
if I'm
26 feet?
And then the second thing is that your flat roof area cannot exceed 15% of the entire roof of itself. So if they're trying to do a complete flat deck, it still won't work.
But if you build a wall that has a tie beam at,
24.
single-story 12, 2
Right.
more feet, and then go, let's say you go 10 feet higher than that, and then put a shed roof back into the house, you haven't precluded doing that here with this restriction.
You're talking about a monopitch roof?
I'm talking about what would look like a flat gabled end, and then the roof pitching back into the building, but only from that one front wall. You could then build higher than the 2-foot restriction because it's no longer a parapet, it's a wall supporting a roof.
Tie beam takes care of that because the tie beam doesn't rake. It doesn't go up.
But
Tie
what,
beam is a horizontal reference point. So that would stop that blank 30-foot wall or whatever you're saying. Because tie beam is still mandated or defined by single-story 12, 2-story 24.
Can I ask a question?
So you won't be able to do it.
if you have a house that's part 2-story and part 1-story, does the structure that is 1-story have the different restrictions than the 2-story part of the house? Or,
Yes.
because it just says maximum building, and I just,
The overall height, don't get, the 36 is the overall ridge height traditionally. But I think that's why I suggest tie beam, because it is defined as a maximum. And that should be the point of reference, that no more than 2 feet be allowed.
Yes,
I think that will take care of your concern,
okay.
yeah,
because
I do too.
Now, do we have the risk that we have a 2-foot parapet and then coming up behind that is a gabled roof to 36 and you see this not very odd design?
it's not an odd design, actually. It's done quite a bit. It's called, in fact, I do it. But it's certain styles of home.
We'll see it anyway when it comes to us.
You know, I think the flip side to that is that you don't want to see the flat roof or the so-called flat roof above the parapet. The
Right.
parapet is there to shroud,
Right.
and so I think we have to make sure that the flat roof, so-called flat roof, has a low enough pitch not to be
That's-
seen from the top of the parapet.
Do we have enough criteria here to?
Well, it says
Prevent
anything
that?
under 4 and 12, but, you know, as we know, a lot of the built product here in town has half parapets, 5 and 6 feet to hide that ridge. So I think, yeah, that's a point that if they are going to do a flat roof, that the ridge not be higher than the parapet.
So can I add, just
Go
because I
ahead,
need
please,
to
Dave.
educate myself a little bit. The parapets were developed so that people could have the illusion of a flat roof but still have a pitch,
Yes.
okay? We want to lower the parapet now to 2 feet. So if we still want to hide that pitch, are we going to change the pitch to a point?
It's lower than the parapet.
Beautiful. I like that.
What we're trying to stop is the 30-foot high
I got
walls,
that.
which
I
I've
like that
mentioned a
too.
number of times here.
I got
Is that vertical, which Rick is quite correct.
So
Have
a
a sheer
two-story
wall.
flat roof house would be restricted to 28 feet total.
26 feet,
26.
The tie beam,
2 above the tie beam.
to build the tie beam, correct.
Okay,
24 or 2.
okay, 24 plus 2. Okay, I was giving 2 feet for the tie beam itself.
Right.
Okay, 26 feet tall.
And do the parapets have to wrap around the home 2 doors down here? Has a parapet across the front, and if you
Pitch roof
drive
on
from the
side.
north, you see a pitched roof, and it looks like a movie set. It looks like a facade that they put up on the street element. You certainly would want the parapet to go beyond the front elevation. So that needs to be incorporated.
And members of the public comment? Good. I have one question of Mark. Mark, do you think that there should be an additional requirement in that the parapet should require some articulation, or just leave that out? No, great, thank you. Good. Okay, so, what action do we need? Tracy,
You'll need a motion and a second to
recommend?
recommend to the town attorney that he draft an ordinance to bring back to you for approval.
Bring back again.
That includes
That
the
includes the-
proposed changes that Marty will be making, and yes.
Right. Good. Okay. Do it by consensus again?
Do a motion and a second for an ordinance.
Okay, motion and second. Okay, we have a motion to, for that item, but with the
Go ahead, Rick.
condition.
I'm motionless. I'm
You're
dying.
motionless, I like that.
The motion would be to direct the staff and town attorney to develop a draft ordinance that incorporates the discussion here about including these elements, the 2-foot parapet wall extending beyond the 24-foot tie beam, that the elements fully hide any sloped roof, and that the parapet wall extend around to the side elevations.
And do you want to make that to extend to such an extent that it's not visible from the public right-of-way, or are you talking about around the entire home, or just visible from the public right-of-way?
I think it would be the front and side elevations, because a view from the neighbor's home is also important. And maybe it's all elevations, Mark, because I think of so many of our homes being on the water, but there are back-to-backs too, so
Sure.
it would extend to all elevations.
All elevations.
And what was your restriction about the pitched roof behind the
I think
parapet?
he covered that, no higher than the parapet.
Right.
No higher than the parapet.
We need a second.
Second, please? Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, last item on the agenda.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to have to, all due respect to Mrs. Martell,
missing the most fun one.
Yeah, this is the fun one.
I'm sure you do.
Thank you, Mike. Okay. Item number 6, discuss potential code amendment regarding sheds.
Just for the record, just want to record that Vice Chair Marsh left the meeting at 10:03.
Good. We have an alternate number here. Is it appropriate to bring the alternate number to the,
Do you need the
Jim?
alternate? Mr. Attorney, do we need the
don't
alternate to
go ahead.
complete the
You don't.
meeting?
It doesn't matter. I mean, you have a quorum. It's up to you all.
Jim?
Jim's here.
Jim's here. Come on up,
He's
Jim.
ready.
Love to have you.
If I could cue this next one up for you,
Yes, please.
Mr. Chair. The town, this has been an ongoing debate and subject of a lot of correspondence and interest in the town by various residents and their representatives. The issue of sheds and the way our code treats sheds, there historically is a hodgepodge of implementation, usage, and placement of utility accessory sheds, both store-bought, custom-made, and others throughout the town. Staff compiled many examples of different communities around the state and their codes and their particular prescriptions and restrictions for accessory and storage sheds. Probably one of the, not the most, but one of the common complaints we get throughout the town is the impact of people's sheds, the placement thereof, and potential visual and physical impacts to neighbors' properties. And currently, our code does not address the number of sheds, the placement, location. Most recent code changes and upgrades that we have done have increased setbacks for drainage and other purposes, and that was not applied onto things like sheds and other situations. In order to consistently allow for a permit and/or code enforce situations throughout the town, we need to look at this issue. It's been requested to be sent to you to have a discussion about it and figure out where we need to go. Get some direction from the P&Z about how we might address this issue that is historically and grandfathered, been all over the map, no pun intended.
Sure.
Or perhaps pun intended.
Good. Any board comment, then we'll open it up to the public.
My view is that we live in a hurricane-prone area, and that these are not built to standards to withstand that. They offer risk of damage to property and people in a storm, and I don't think it's something we should encourage.
Good, thank you. Any other board member comment? We'll come back to the board, but
Well, I agree with Rick. From a practical point of view, I think sheds have high utility to a lot of the people in the town. And I understand they're not built to hurricane grade, but there's probably a lot of things in the town that don't stand up to that. So I like the Pinellas County description myself, the first one up. And I'm one of those rare people who does his own lawn work, so I don't have a big enough house to put my lawnmower in, and it serves me well. And it's not obtrusive, it's pretty well hidden from everything. And when the storm comes, I take all the stuff out and put it in the garage. So
But that structure could break apart.
it's plastic, yes, it could, but hasn't happened yet. I mean,
And is it affixed to your home, or is it freestanding?
Freestanding. It won't hit your house.
just as,
Unless it's a Cat 4 coming from the
just
south.
as trailers, living trailers can be secured to meet hurricane standards, I wonder if sheds can be likewise secured to meet hurricane standards. I don't know. Public comment?
It can be anchored
Oh, sorry.
similarly,
Pardon?
Mr. Chair. Sheds can be, but however, the shed itself needs to meet the standard first.
Yeah, there's
and
two
Then it can
criteria.
be
Yeah,
anchored.
Understood. Okay.
And there are engineered sheds.
There are, okay.
I think we need to break things down on size and whether it's something that would come under a building code at a certain size, whether it's something that it would just be inspected to ensure that it's anchored, and then to address the ones I call throwaway, blowaway, which is, I think, what we're talking about here, the plastic ones. I don't think that's any more dangerous than a swing set in the backyard or a child's playground sort of setup. People do that without any permitting. I think if a neighbor doesn't complain, I think your shed, that type of small shed should be fine. And I don't think it needs to take up anything more restrictive than what we've allowed for, like generators. We're allowing a generator to be 5 foot from the property line. I think if a plastic throwaway shed is at least set back that far, I think we should permit that unless a neighbor complains. And then I think that's something that just needs to be you know, commented on by the building official if he goes out and looks at it. If he thinks it encroaches on a neighbor, they need to move it.
And then by virtue of the previous item that we discussed, does a shed automatically come before us if Wayne thinks it ought to?
I think we ought to have a process where, we know where all sheds are, but I think the type that, we're talking about with the plastic ones, I think, that should be just something that the town sends out a notification that this is our new code in regards to sheds. And I think that should be a compliance issue with the individual, unless a neighbor complains. I think once you get into a shed that's, 8 by 10 and needs to be anchored to the ground, I think it should have some small permitting expense, and Wayne should go out there and just determine that A, it's engineered, and B, it's anchored. Once it passes another certain size, it should be another level of fee, and it should meet the building code, and it should meet all the appurtenant FARs, pervious, impervious, and it should meet setback requirements.
And should it have landscape screening, and should it be completely out of the setback line?
That's,
Or with
that's,
the- yeah.
I think all those are fair discussions.
Sure, right, setback, screening,
Yeah, because many of them are built on the property line now, is that correct?
which is awful.
Yeah.
Right, and I think we need to have restrictions on, utilities, no motor vehicles in them. I mean, there's a lot of things that we need to build into it. But I think we should have levels of responsibility and levels of permitting that we, allow a certain amount of it, and then a certain amount of time grandfathering that we say, if you've got something there now and it doesn't comply, you got X number of years to comply, or it's gotta be updated or removed.
Good, public comment, please?
Cindy Martell, 46 South Harbor Drive. So I'm not opposed to having a shed. I just think there needs to be guidelines. I think there needs to be codes in place to protect your neighbors. Sheds, should not be allowed in the setback, which you discussed, and I believe in that. I would suggest the shed to be far away from your neighbor's property to avoid the water runoff. That's another big. Shed should be hurricane resistant to eliminate the chance of a wind projectile, which we discussed. Sheds should not be visible from the road. It should not be visible from your neighbor's property. Because you could put up a purple shed. That's just really bad for your neighbor. I think a permit should be required. I think the size should be 100 square feet, no height of the 8 feet. I think there should be one shed per household. And it should be aesthetically pleasing to have, a town to go ahead and vote on that, and just hidden by landscape. So nobody sees it or they're aware of it. So, but thank you. Thank you so much.
Pretty common sense stuff to me.
Yep.
Good, so,
Mr. Chairman?
oh, yes, I'm sorry, Lisa.
That's okay. May I just respectfully request also that it stays out of all swaled areas, retention,
Oh, gosh,
detention
yes.
areas,
Yes.
and areas that are counted for storage. So
Absolutely.
we can't have them sitting in a swale
Right.
or a low-lying area that was used to compute the 1-inch storage on the site.
Yes, thank you, important. Yes, Mr. Magruder, Commissioner Magruder, I should say.
I agree with Neil, I think there's probably a number of standard size sheds that can be purchased and brought in and erected either by the homeowner or by a contractor. So I think Neil's on the right path, that we should probably have some ordinances based on standard sizes. The one thing that I really think that we should stay away from is if the neighbor complains, because once you get into that, you have a whole nother set of problems that involves the police, the administration and whatnot. So if you went back to having standard sizes and standard methods for erecting it, you keep the neighbor complaints down.
Thank you, Don. Well, good. I think the set of standards that Cindy and Mr. Martell articulated are good ones, plus Lisa's standard, meaning, just to kind of be redundant, but go over them real quickly. One is height, one is size, one is out of the setback, the other is out of the swale area, and the screening, and then the one that is a little bit, I'm not sure how to state the standard, but the hurricane-resistant quality of the shed. I mean, I think there ought to be something. Engineered properly, and at a certain point, anchored properly. So,
If I could, just kind of a real quick question. You know, I mean, I've seen those sheds, and, you know, this might be something like what you're talking about, you know, where they're, like for your bicycles, it's the Rubbermaid shed, it's the, you know, 4 or 5 feet high, it's about 8 feet long, and you just, exactly, and you put it together with the plastic pieces clicked together. Now, are you talking about trying to regulate something like that? Or no, you aren't worried about that? It's the bigger, there's going to be a minimum size that you want to hit before you get that? Because those are some of the conversations that we as staff have had, because at what point do you start trying to, you know, have regulations governing, you know, what if somebody comes in with like, well, look, I've got a plastic bench here that's 3 feet by 5 feet that I put my pool toys in, are you gonna make me get a permit for that? I don't think that's where you're going. So, but that's, you know, do you want staff to kind of come back with certain, you know, with Wayne, I think he's got some good ideas on this as far as the hurricane stuff, where it's, if it falls below a certain minimum size, then maybe a permit's not needed or something like that, but anything above that, a permit is needed, and you've got to meet all of our requirements, which would include hurricane, you know, all the hurricane requirements and the tie downs and all of those things.
Towns that I've looked at, if it's under 25 feet, it's plastic, it's an assembled building, doesn't require any permit, and can be placed, you know, in a reasonable location. And I think that's the type you're talking about.
Yeah, and I really liked Neil's idea of this being something that doesn't have to be done tomorrow, that there's a point certain where compliance works out.
Because I think there will be quite a few
Quite a
number
few.
of sheds in the town that will.
Be non-compliant.
do we have the power to require all non-conforming sheds to be changed, or is grandfathering pretty well established as a given?
Well, you know, you can propose an ordinance, however, well, yeah, however you want to say it, but we may want to look at the grandfathering first to give a certain period of time to maybe come into compliance or something like that.
Okay.
But certainly those that are built on the property lines need to be phased out at some point.
Right,
Yeah,
like rather quickly.
yeah, and then the one thing we haven't addressed is height. I've seen from 8 feet in here on some of these to 15 feet.
The plastic ones, I was proposing that they would be, no higher than 7 feet. And I've seen other towns that have kept the buildings to, if they're 80 feet or more, or 100, whatever we decide on a number, that would be building code. So, and then structures less than that, limit them to 10. If they're between 25 and 80 or 100, you limit it to 9 or 10. That seems to be the engineered building sizes that I've seen online when I've gone shopping for these things. So, if that's too high, then if you restrict it down to 8 or 8.5 feet, you're probably eliminating 3/4 of the buildings that are available. But if that's what we want to do, that's still appropriate.
Right.
But that's the range.
So,
Let Wayne do some more work.
yeah.
Can I just
Yeah, please.
Visibility,
Yeah.
having the visibility of just like, even if you pull into your driveway, you're seeing this, it's like it's a building. It's
Yeah.
another, it could be somebody that can have it as a she shed. So it's like, so I don't wanna see that in our town.
Sure,
Or have it in
absolutely.
somebody's front yard.
One accessory building, correct?
But, so therefore, we want
Don't we permit
Wayne-
one accessory building in the town?
There's no limit.
We want Wayne to
Actually, that's
consider all of these
That is
factors
correct. There's-
in
it's not
proposing
number.
something to this board, because I think all of these factors are important. And then I'm gonna add one more that we have not discussed, and just as we have requested that any exterior changes come before us, do we want all shed proposals to come before us as a P and Z Architectural Review Board? What, any feeling about that? Certain size?
Certain size.
Certain size, okay. Anything over Neil's?
Well, I think if it's a disposable plastic one, I don't think that.
I don't think we need to
germinates
review
for us at all.
disposable
So any-
plastic
any-
ones, but.
Any permanent type things come
Semi-permanent
before
or
us?
permanent.
Period. And then we can better address that aesthetic factor too.
And the reason why, I would agree with you, Jerry, that it should come to us. It seems like, a small element, why should we be seeing? These are elements that are encroaching towards other homeowners.
Yes.
And it gives the other homeowner an opportunity to come and speak.
Yes, right.
And so I think it would be a good idea. And I don't think it's gonna take a lot of our time.
I agree. And I think, I just want to pick up on that one more point that was made, and that is the phasing out and not allow grandfathering forever and ever, because, especially if they're on a property line, that doesn't work. So let's be very strict, I could say it that way, about that factor. Okay, good. So, consensus? Consensus, yes. So does everybody agree that we pass the ball back to staff and, we're good at that, really, all day, all morning, to come up with an ordinance, which includes all of the factors that we've discussed. Good, thank you. Good.
One of staff's functions, just for clarity, would be to organize the types of sheds proposed into classes or categories, so the pre-manufactured, pre-bought,
Yes.
install yourself, the ones that you assemble on site, and then the ones that trigger building codes and hurricane codes and all those
Like
kinds of
that.
things.
So, yeah, semi-permanent manufacturer.
And of course, through this whole meeting, Jamie has been smiling as we pass the buck to staff, because he's gonna be out of here, so he doesn't care.
I care deeply, Mr. Chair. and
Oh, okay.
I've enjoyed working with all of you through all of this, and
And you've
call
been
me if
great.
you want me to opine on any of this in the near future. I'd be happy to.
Thank you, we do appreciate you, and, motion to adjourn?
I move to adjourn.
Second.
Second, all in favor? Aye. Thanks.
Nicely done.
Thank you, Jamie. Last